Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Father Ben Shambaugh. I'm the priest here at St. Luke's, and I want to welcome you to St. Luke's and to this second installation of the winter series of the East Hampton Historical Society. It's a delight to have you here. If you have time, the church itself is historic as well. And it is open and lights are on. If you go right down this hallway and then turn left, you can make your way in there. Also, if you go down this hallway just to your right, you'll see the restrooms there, a question people often ask. I'm relatively new to East Hampton, and I'm always discovering more about East Hampton and our history and the history we share, and the Amistad is part of that. And so I'll let us get to that. I want to introduce Steve Long.
I think I know most of you. I'm Steve Long. I'm the Executive Director of the East Hampton Historical Society. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Special thanks to Father Ben and the whole team here at St. Luke's. Charlie's in the back there. Raise your hand, Charlie. Big. Oscar. Everybody here has been so terrific, and I think we may be working together again with the Landmarks Conservancy of New York has a Sacred Sites open house. Sites all over New York State open their doors, historic sites that are religious institutions, and we'll be here. Look for the information. It's going to be happening, I think, the 16th and 17th of May, so really excited. We're hoping to have just as many religious organizations that are historic as possible here in East Hampton participating in the open house. I also want to especially recognize Hugh King, we should always recognize him. He's the one who suggested this evening's speaker and topic. He and Barbara Borsak, who could not be here this evening, they curate the series, and so grateful for their help. Please join us again. I want to make sure I mention this before the end. Next month, we're going to be welcoming Donna Murray Barnes and David Rattray from the Plain Sight Project. They're going to be talking about the history of slavery in East Hampton. And in April, Bob Hefner explains how the Domini shops returned to North Main Street. So please come back in May to see that. Tonight, we're thrilled to have Mia Certic from the Montauk Historical Society speak about the Amistad. I learned recently that Mia has moved something like 18 times, but the one constant in her life has been Montauk since she was 7 years old. After working for years in documentary film production and historical research, Mia was appointed the first ever Executive Director of the Montauk Historical Society. And let me tell you, she has made a huge impact. They're very lucky to have her. This August, she's already working on having a full-scale replica of the Amistad return to Montauk and offer tours and other programming to the public. So excited to hear more about that and more about the history of the Amistad. Thank you so much, Mia, and thank you all.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks everyone for coming, and special thanks, of course, to Steve Long for inviting me here to speak to you, and to Hugh King, whose idea it was. It is really a huge honor to be here to talk to you about the story of the Amistad. I have to put my glasses on now. First of all, I have to say that it amazes me that the Amistad dropped anchor not even half a mile from where I live in Montauk. Just off the beach, my friends and I used to go to when we were teenagers, and we didn't want our parents to find us. We called it the end of the world. And I'll bet that's what it looked like to the passengers of the Amistad, too, when the tide dragged their ship away from the lighthouse, that reassuring beacon on Montauk Point, where they had hoped to come ashore and find safe haven. Here's a picture of the loading point that my husband took last summer. I don't think it's changed an awful lot from the way it looked on that steaming hot August day in 1839, when the Amistads, starving, thirsty, desperate, but incredibly resourceful passengers, sent a party ashore to look for food and fresh water, and ended up being arrested for piracy and murder. This story has been told many times, probably most famously by Steven Spielberg in his 1997 movie, but also in well-researched books and articles in a series of plays, the first one performed back in 1841, and interestingly, in several children's books. Over the years, the story and its protagonists have been represented in paintings, sketches, and even waxworks. I first started researching the Amistad when Dr. Georgette Greer-Key invited me to give a little talk about it at the Eastville Community Historical Society a couple of years ago. Georgette was hosting a weekend event, and the theme of it was Teach the Truth. She asked me if I would come and speak about the East End connections to this story, a story that eventually led to a huge step towards the abolition of slavery, a landmark Supreme Court case, and a test of both the American legal system and our nation's very humanity. Teach the truth is a pretty powerful directive, and it's particularly challenging when you're dealing with a complicated story that has been told many times before, often with what might be called poetic license, or a cavalier attitude towards the facts, or less charitably, a deliberate bending and twisting of events to fit a specific narrative. If you do any serious research about historical events, you learn rather quickly that you can never take veracity for granted. Does anybody here remember Ronald Reagan's nuclear arms negotiations with Mikhail Gorbachev? And his proud recitation of what is apparently a famous Russian saying, "Doverya, no proverya," trust but verify. Well, when it comes to historical research, we can shorten that saying to proverya, verify, don't trust. And with that in mind, here's some of what we know about the Amistad story. In 1839, a Portuguese slave ship called the Tesoura left what is now Sierra Leone with its human cargo of some 500 to 600 people, most of whom had been kidnapped from inland villages, torn away from their homes, their families, and everything familiar and beloved, and sold into slavery in the infamous port of Lomboko. The conditions on the Tesoura were almost unimaginable. People were shackled to each other by hands and feet, chained together by the waist and at the neck, and forced into a space so cramped that they could neither stand up nor lie down. When one person leaned forward, so did the entire row. Food and water were restricted. The only fresh air and light came from small grates in the ceiling. The prisoners didn't know where they were going, or why, or what awaited them once they arrived. As they huddled together in the dark hold of the ship, people got sick. Some got really sick and died. Usually, between 10 and 15 out of every 100 succumbed during a journey like this. The lifeless bodies, when discovered, would be unshackled and thrown overboard. It was not an unknown practice on slave ships to throw even living people overboard if they were troublesome or sickly, and then claim them as an insurance loss. We've all heard these stories, but it's hard to really take it in and imagine what that experience must have been like. The staggering inhumanity of the captors, the terror and hopelessness of the captives. The Tesoura finally landed in Cuba after 8 grueling weeks of travel. The survivors were brought ashore at night to avoid detection. Because at this point, in 1839, trading in slaves, that is, kidnapping people in Africa and taking them away forcibly to sell into slavery, well, you'll be happy to know it was illegal. In Cuba, then a Spanish territory, selling enslaved people was permissible only when the slaves were Spanish citizens or born in Spain or in another Spanish possession. It turns out, though, that law was largely ignored. A lot of that had to do with sugar. Britain had built much of its empire on slave labor, finally abolishing the slave trade in 1807 after practicing it for 148 years. This led to, among other things, a decline in sugar production in British colonies. But there was no decline in the public's appetite for sugar. So the door opened for Cuba and Brazil to make up that loss in the global market, which, as they saw it, necessitated the importation of ever more Africans to work in the sugar fields. That's why Spain's 1820 ban on the importation of slaves was not enforced in Cuba. Simply speaking, it wasn't good for business. By 1839, almost half of that island's population was made up of people of African descent. Now, back to the Africans who traveled on the Tesoro. Once they arrived in Havana, they were put into barracoons outside the city, holding cells, I guess you'd call them, until they were sold to new owners. After a few weeks, 49 of the men, sorry, is that good now? 49 of the men were purchased by a Spaniard named Jose Ruiz, who intended to sell them on to sugar plantation owners in the center of the island. They joined 4 African children, aged about 7 to 12, who were purchased by another Spaniard, Pedro Montes, from a tobacconist in Havana. All of them were eventually loaded onto the Amistad, a compact, speedy schooner, for what should have been a journey of 3 to 7 days. I'd like to digress for a moment and say a word about the children here. I'm not sure if they knew any of the men aboard, but they did share a common language. 3 of them were girls and 1 was a boy. I don't know what Pedro Montes intended to do or did do with them. I don't like to think about that, to tell you the truth. The girls were called Margaret, Cagne, and Teme, and the boy was Kale. They would play a huge role in the story of the uprising and the later stories as well. Now, unlike the Tesoro, which was a real slave ship, the Amistad didn't have a barricado on the main deck. This was a defensive bulwark that the crew would shelter behind with their muskets, shooting at any captives who dared to attempt insurrection. In fact, the Amistad's hold was so full of cargo, clothing, foodstuffs, wine, saddles, sugarcane harvesting equipment, etc., that half the captives were crowded in among chests and barrels and casks, while the other half were forced to sleep on the main deck, just feet away from their captors. For the unhappy prisoners, food was scarce and water was severely rationed. And to make matters worse, the cook, Celestino, regularly taunted them by showily taking long gulps of water from his canteen when they were rationed to a teacupful morning and evening. And remember, this was in Cuba in the summer, with people crowded together in close quarters and temperatures in the 90s. So one day, a few desperate Africans found an unattended barrel of water and helped themselves to a drink. Their punishment was a series of beatings so brutal that 4 months later, they still bore the scars. When one of the captive people, Cinque, asked Celestino what was to become of them, the cook replied with sign language to suggest that they would be killed, cut into small pieces, salted, and loaded into barrels for the Spaniards to eat. The scene had been set for rebellion. The Africans were exhausted, hungry, thirsty, and convinced that they were being taken somewhere. Have I gone? Yeah, only to be murdered. Can you hear me? I'm not hearing my usual echo. They had nothing to lose. And the Amistad was operating with a skeleton crew. The captain, the cook, 2 crew members, and an enslaved teenager called Antonio, the property of Captain Ferrer. The other 2 white men on the boat were Pedro Montes and Jose Ruiz, the enslavers. The prisoners held a meeting and made a life and death decision. Together they would rise up, kill their captors, reclaim their freedom, and try to sail the Amistad back to Sierra Leone. Cinque, now emerging as a leader, found a nail and managed to use it to unshackle himself and his fellow prisoners. And on that moonless night, When the crew had fallen into exhausted sleep after battling a storm, 4 of the Africans stole onto the deck, found the sleeping Celestino, and bludgeoned him to death. The commotion woke the captain and the others, and open rebellion took over the main deck. Captain Ferrer grabbed a dagger and a club and fought back, killing 1 rebel and mortally wounding another. He yelled at the Africans to cease and desist, but his commands were ignored. In fact, more men poured onto the deck, now armed with sugarcane knives. I just want to mention that these seem to have been procured by the little girls, Margaret, Cagney, and Temme. The girls had not been kept in chains, and they had used their freedom constructively to find out what was in those big boxes that were stored with the cargo, and to fetch them when the time came. When the fighting stopped, the captain was dead, the 2 crew members had jumped into a canoe and paddled furiously back towards Cuba, and one of the slave owners had been wounded. This is one of the fabulous Amistad murals that were painted in 1938 by African-American artist Hale Woodruff at Talladega College. You can see the Spaniards here, and there are the 2 crew members sneaking away. Anyway, when they saw that they couldn't win, the Spaniards dropped to their knees and pleaded for their lives, and the Africans, nothing if not practical, agreed to spare them if they would steer a course for Sierra Leone. Ruiz and Montes eagerly agreed. But they lied. By day they sailed towards the rising sun as the Africans instructed, but they did so with loose sails to slow their progress. At night, the Spaniards set their course to the northwest, hoping to be intercepted by an American vessel. Their former prisoners knew little of sailing or geography, but they were suspicious of Ruiz and Montes. What is more, they were thirsty. When they had set forth from Havana, the original crew of the Amistad hadn't laid in very many casks for water, since they expected the voyage to Puerto Príncipe to take a matter of days. Now, a few weeks out, the situation was dire. The Africans tried to collect all the rainwater they could, wringing the sails to try to get every last drop, but it was never enough. This meant that every few days they were compelled to stop, drop anchor, and go ashore to try to refill the few vessels they had, each time risking discovery and recapture. As they began slowly north, they passed other ships and were sometimes spotted when they lay at anchor. Occasionally they were able to barter with the other vessels, exchanging a doubloon or 2 for a cask of water and some fresh food. But other boats, seeing the tattered state of the ship and its all-black crew, gave it wide berth. Newspapers began to carry stories of a long, low black schooner with tattered sails and barnacles and seagrass festooning its hull. After 2 months at sea, the ship found itself traveling along the south shore of Long Island. At last, in late August of 1839, the Amistad rounded Montauk Point and traveled another few miles to Culloden Point, the place the kids call the end of the world. This is actually a representation of the Amistad arriving at Culloden Point. It was done by an unknown artist. Quick word about maritime law as it was in 1839. There was something called the doctrine of salvage, which meant that if you helped to secure a ship that was sinking or out of control, you were eligible to claim a portion of the goods on the ship. This law was put into effect to create an incentive for people to help rescue sinking ships, so it makes sense, because saving a ship in distress could be a death-defying business. Of course, if the ship was carrying slaves, they would likely be considered part of the cargo, and you would be eligible to make a claim against their value as well. When the Amistad got to Culloden Point, a large party of Africans paddled to the shore, where they happened upon a group of farmers, 4 men and 2 dogs. 2 of the hunters, Henry Green and Peletiah Fordham, were ship's captains from Sag Harbor. One way or another, the Amistads reportedly made it clear that they wished to return to Africa, and they gave the white men some goods with the suggestion of more to come to help them get there. We digress for a moment. I say they reportedly made it clear because, quite frankly, as we will shortly find out, the Amistad Africans spoke no English, and in fact most of them spoke a language, Mende, that was virtually unknown in the northeast of America at that time. Nevertheless, article after article appeared in newspapers at that time, having the Africans asking questions in pidgin English, such as, "What country is this? Is this slavery country?" While Captain Green, quote, told them that in the morning he would pilot them to Sag Harbor, with the implication that the Africans not only understood him, they knew what Sag Harbor was. Even in 1839, though, there were journalists who recognized the absurdity of this. The New York Sun's reporter, after quoting a supposed back and forth between the Amistads and the American captains, mused, "How this conversation could have occurred when not one of the Negroes can speak a word of English is a mystery to us, unless Captain Green or his friend speak Congolese." And I'm sorry to say that the story of that conversation continues to appear today in modern texts that are otherwise well researched and are still repeated as fact by those who should know better. Anyway, back at the loading point, the captains may not have wanted to sail a broken down ship back to Africa, but they weren't opposed to cashing in where they could. The Amistads flashed some gold doubloons, and Green and Fordham made the assumption that there were plenty more where those came from. As the men stood on the shore, presumably negotiating, the U.S. brig Washington appeared nearby, heading straight for the Amistad. The Washington was a survey ship doing soundings in the waters between Gardiner's Island and Montauk. Its officers, Thomas Gedney and Richard Meade, noting the ragged sails and banged-up hull of the Amistad, assumed that it was a pirate ship. The two men boarded it and were met with Ruiz and Montes, who told them their side of the story. As for the African side of the story, well, that wouldn't be heard for a long time. Gedney and Meade sent armed sailors ashore to capture the landing party and bring it back to the Amistad. Then they towed the boat across the Block Island Sound to New London, Connecticut. It's worth mentioning that at that time, while slavery was outlawed in New York, Connecticut was still a slave state. Now effectively a prison ship, the Amistad was anchored several hundred yards offshore at New London, while Lieutenant Gedney sent an urgent message to Judge Andrew Judson of the District Court of New Haven, notifying him that the Africans had committed piracy and murder. By this time, there were 39 surviving adults of the 49 who had set out from Havana. 2 were killed in the mutiny, and 8 succumbed to illness on the journey. Judge Judson held court initially on board the Washington, which was only a short distance from the schooner, later adjourning to the Amistad itself so that he could inspect it and interview the enslaved teenager, Antonio, to find out who was responsible for killing the captain and the cook. Cinque was identified as the ringleader, with the result that he and the other 38 men were committed for trial in Hartford, Connecticut on September 17, 1839. When this case went to court, much was made of the notion of jurisdiction. The lawyers for the Amistad Africans pointing out that since the ship was seized in New York waters, it should be tried in New York State and not in Connecticut. Only if it was seized on the high seas could it legitimately be tried in any district court of the land. Eventually, after careful study, it was determined that the Amistad could in fact be tried in Connecticut, since it was found anchored a few hundred yards off the coast of Montauk, which was equivalent to the high seas, since everybody understood that Montauk was only a sandy protuberance and presumably not really land at all. Steven Spielberg's film focused especially on the trials that the Africans were subjected to, and he has been criticized, justly or not, for spending too much time in the courtroom with white men and too little time with the Africans. But one thing he portrayed pretty effectively was the way claims of ownership and salvage seemed to dominate the initial proceedings and count for much more than the human lives that were at stake. Here are some of those claims. Gedney and Meade of the U.S. brig Washington sued for a significant portion of the value of the Amistad's cargo, despite the fact that they were naval officers who were doing their job. Captains Green and Fordham of the hunting party said that they too deserved a percentage of the cargo, including the value of the slaves, since they had captured the Africans who had come ashore. Montes and Ruiz sued separately, claiming that the enslaved people were their private property and could not be included in the salvage sale per a U.S. treaty with Spain. The Spanish government claimed that since the Amistad had been rescued by a U.S. government-owned armored ship, the U.S. was obliged to return the ship and its cargo to the Spanish owners. The Africans responded, since they had been kidnapped in Africa by Spanish slave traders, and since slavery and the slave trade were illegal in New York, where the Amistad had landed, they should be released from custody and set free, which is the only sort of logical argument to make. As you can see from this painting, there was a lot of drama inside the courtroom, but there was plenty outside it as well. So that's supposed to be Pedro Ruiz, and that's Cinque, and various legal teams there. So there was something about the bravery of the enslaved Africans that struck a chord with the public, especially in Connecticut. Abolitionists, whose numbers were growing very quickly in those years, threw themselves into this case with incredible zeal and dedication. Thousands of people paid money to go and visit the Amistads in jail, often bringing presents for them, as well as payments for their jailer. For their part, the Africans consistently blew the audience away with their demonstration of athletic and gymnastic prowess. Somehow, even without the benefit of verbal communication, they won their place in the public heart. Cinque, in particular, was repeatedly singled out as a dignified, strong, determined leader. Even newspaper articles in pro-slavery journals describe him in terms of awe. In particular, he was noted for giving long speeches in his native language, which were often described as powerful and eloquent, and were sometimes extensively quoted in English in the abolitionist press, which is pretty amazing, considering that the people writing the articles had no way of comprehending what he said. A little while ago, I said that the African side of the story wouldn't be heard for a long time. That's partly because there were seemingly respectable white men, like the enslavers and whaling captains, who told their version, and they were listened to. But it's also because for the longest time, nobody quite knew where the Africans came from or what language they spoke. It says a lot for how clever and resourceful they were, that they achieved so much without being able to speak to the Americans. The lawyers and abolitionists brought in African interpreters, but for the longest time, they just couldn't find anyone who spoke the mystery language that was native to most of the Amistads. Here's where the little girls come in again, Margaret, Cagne, and Teme. They taught Yale professor Josiah Gibbs some basic words in their language, including numbers. He then went to the New York waterfront and walked up and down, loudly counting from 1 to 10 in Mende. At length, 2 sailors approached him and responded in Mende. He had found his interpreters. That's when things started to turn around, when the true story could be told. And when the true story was told, the Africans won. The case was found to be so strong that even District Court Judge Andrew Judson, a man famous for his opposition to giving African American students even a basic education, even he found in favor of the rebels of the Amistad. But though the battle was won, the war continued. Judge Judson's verdict was appealed by President Van Buren and the United States, and the case made its slow way to the Supreme Court. Several died during their incarceration as they waited for justice to be done. To while away their time in jail, the Africans studied. Though they came from an oral tradition and a language that had no written form, they managed to learn to read, write, and speak English, thanks to their own determination and the efforts of many who volunteered hours of their time. The Mende interpreters, Professor Gibbs and his students from Yale, and abolitionists and missionaries with their Bibles. If you have ever studied a foreign language, you know how hard it is to express yourself with words and grammar that are not what you were brought up with. Imagine being an adult when you're first introduced to the concept that squiggles on a page can represent words and ideas. And then learning how to read those squiggles and create your own. And then imagine writing this letter that 11-year-old Kale wrote to ex-President John Quincy Adams, who was to appear before the Supreme Court on their behalf. To be clear, It is assumed that Kala had plenty of input from Cinque and other elders when he wrote this, but still, I mean, his penmanship alone, pretty remarkable. I'll read some of it here. Dear friend, Mr. Adams, I want to write a letter to you because you love Mendi people and you talk to the Grand Court. We want to tell you one thing. Jose Ruiz say we born in Havana. He tell lie. We stay in Havana 10 days and 10 nights. We stay no more. We all born in Mendi. We no understand the Spanish language. Mendi people been in America 17 moons. We talk American language a little, not very good. We write every day. We write plenty letters. We read most all time. We all read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and plenty of little books. We love books very much. We want you to ask the court what we have done wrong. What for Americans keep us in prison? Some people say Mendi people crazy. Mendi people don't, because we no talk American language. American people no talk Mendi language. American people crazy dolts? They tell bad things about Mendi people and we no understand. Some men say Mendi people very happy because they laugh and have plenty to eat. Mr. Pendleton, that's the jailer, Mr. Pendleton come and Mendi people all look sorry because they think about Mendi land and friends we no see now. Mr. Pendleton say we feel anger and white men afraid of us. Then we no look sorry again. That's why we laugh. But Mendi people feel bad. Oh, we can't tell how bad. Some people say Mendi people no have souls. Why we feel bad if we have no souls? We want to be free very much. Dear friend, Mr. Adams, you have children, you have friends, you love them. You feel very sorry if Mendi people come and take all to Africa. We want you to tell court that Mendi people no want to go back to Havana. We don't want to be killed. Dear friend, we want you to know how we feel. Mendi people have got souls. We think we know God punish us if we tell lie. We never tell lie, we speak the truth. What for Mendi people afraid? Because they have got souls. Cook say he kill, he eat Mendi people, we afraid. We kill Cook. Then Captain kill one man with knife and cut Mendi people plenty. We never kill Captain if he no kill us. If court asks who bring Mendi people to America, we bring ourselves. Sisi hold the rudder. All we want is make us free, not send us to Havana. Send us home. Give us missionary. We tell Mendi people Americans spoke truth. We give them good tidings. We tell them there is one God. You must worship him. Make us free, and we will bless you, and all Mendi people will bless you, dear friend, Mr. Adams. John Quincy Adams, who addressed the court for over 7 hours with great eloquence, acknowledged that some of his arguments had come directly from Kale's letter. Ultimately, despite 5 of its 9 members coming from southern slave states or having connections with them, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Amistad Africans, granting them their freedom and the right to return to their homeland. Ostensibly, the decision rested on a fine but rather ignoble point of law, which was that as they had not been born into slavery, they consequently had the right to liberty. Interesting that an accident of birth into freedom or slavery should determine what rights a human being should have. It was a bad law, but in this case, it worked for the good. It's wonderful to see that the long and cruel story of the Amistads in America ended with justice prevailing and the Africans finally able to go back to their Mende homeland in Sierra Leone on a ship paid for by abolitionists and missionaries and by the money that they themselves raised with public appearances throughout the Northeast. Here's Hale Woodruff's depiction of their arrival in Africa. There's a lot we don't know about what happened there, but it was surely more complicated than the happy ending we see in this picture. What happened to Cinques in particular is subject to debate. He found his family, he didn't find his family. He helped the missionaries, he defied the missionaries. He's buried in a secret shrine. He's buried at the mission where he returned to be laid to rest with Christian rites. I have even read in a book published in New York in 1953 that Cinque became a thief and rich slave trader a story that has, since the book's publication, been repeated with authority. But I've looked and have not been able to find any supporting evidence for this assertion. I did, however, find this statement in the books afterward. Quote, "When the facts were all assembled," said the author, "when the facts were all assembled, I still had to decide how they should be presented. The choices soon narrowed to two. One, a completely factual treatment with the inclusion of pertinent documents and footnoted references. The other, a dramatic telling. I have chosen the latter." No kidding, and thanks for nothing. We can speculate endlessly as to why so many falsehoods still cling to this story. In the case of those who sued for salvage or the return of their possessions, money was clearly a motivating factor. For the journalists, there may have been editorial influence that shaped their narrative, or simply a reluctance to check facts when quoting what others had published before was so much easier. The abolitionists who seem to have invented Cinque's speeches likely did so in an effort to ennoble and humanize the Amistad rebels. But they were already noble and human, and even well-intentioned white lies are still lies, and they discredit the brave, brilliant, resourceful people from Mendyland. So I want to go back to this idea about the truth. The truth is precious, and it has to be protected. We have to keep seeking, recognizing, and teaching it wherever we can. When I started looking into the local aspects of this story, I was interested in who the four white hunters were, what their personal stories were. There wasn't an awful lot about them in the papers I could find. I Googled their names and Amistad, and I kept seeing the same stuff. But then I Googled Captain Henry Green, East Hampton, and I found that he was the subject of a children's book a few years ago written by a local Long Island author. It's called Captain Henry Green, a Whaler, and it's based on some of Green's journals. I was curious about whether it contained anything about his involvement in the Amistad affair. Remember that he sued for salvage rights on the captives, taking credit for detaining them. Sure enough, it did. Here's the captain telling his grandson his side of the story. "Tom, there's a rule of maritime law that allows for a salvage lien. Anyone who helps a ship in distress can place a lien against the abandoned ship and cargo for the value of services rendered. 3 liens were filed against the Amistad. Uncle Duke Fordham and I placed a lien on some of the cargo of the ship, but it was denied by the courts. Another lien was filed by the crew of the Washington. It was granted at 1/3 of the salvage cost. The third claim, by Ruiz and Montes, was denied because the Africans were deemed free men and not property. Your uncle and I were just walking on the beach hunting when we became involved in a famous case. Can you imagine?" "I didn't know you were famous, Grandpa." "That's enough today, Tom. Not famous enough, as I have work to do. Back to school for you and back to milking cows for me. We'll talk more about whaling tomorrow." It is horrifying to see a book intended for children that excuses and whitewashes Captain Green's appalling role in the Amistad affair. I wonder why the author chose to do this. Did the idea of Green trying to profit from the enslavement of other humans get in the way of her characterization of him as a folksy grandpa? That's my guess. But who cares? Because what the author has done here sends a message that when part of the truth is inconvenient, it can be ignored. And that diminishes not only the suffering of the Amistads, but the sweet victory of the justice that the courts finally granted them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone like to ask any questions?
Where were those murals? Where can they be found?
They're in Talladega College, but you can find reproductions of them online.
Can you found it in Florida?
Yeah.
Thank you. How did they get there?
Sorry?
How did they get there?
They were commissioned for that. for the 100-year anniversary of the Amistad.
Where is this sculpture?
That is in Connecticut.
Okay. There's nothing here in Montauk.
Well, actually, there is the, we have two things in Montauk. One is the blue and yellow sign, the state historic marker, which we had dedicated last summer. And that is at the Logan Point. And the other one is at the Lighthouse. There's one that the Eastville Community Historical Society put up at the Lighthouse about 10 years ago.
Where will the Amistad stop when it comes?
So the Amistad is coming here from about the 23rd to the 29th of August, and it's going to be moored at a dock in Montauk. And we're hoping it will also, at one point, come to Logan Point. We'll be able to see it as it was.
Wow.
It's a pretty amazing thing, but they have really great programming that free tours and workshops for kids and for teachers. It's really going to be great.
This is a brand new ship that's being built?
It was built about 20 years ago. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, about 12 years ago, it was docked in Sag Harbor, and I was able to go on it. It was chilling, actually, to go down where the people were. It was
I can
really
imagine.
chilling.
What dock, Mom?
Eddie Ecker Dock? Do you hear where that is?
You know it was there before, right?
Yeah, that's what, yeah.
Yeah, I do. That's exactly where it was before as well. But that's been, it's the easiest, it's most accessible, and least crowded.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.